I was a Snohomish County Deputy Sheriff assigned to the Detective Division. I was contacted by the dispatcher. They were requesting that I respond to an address in the Alderwood area regarding a homicide and that they needed somebody to process the crime scene for fingerprints.
Susan Schwarz's boyfriend arrives home after a day at work to find the 24-year-old woman dead on the floor.
The house was off the main road. It wasn't very large. The home looked very tidy, very well-kept, but there was a body in the bathroom, a female subject. Her hands were tied behind her back with what appeared to be some type of electrical cord. She was nude, and she appeared to have a gunshot wound to her head.
There was a pillow next to her head that had blood on it and a bullet hole shot through it. And there was blood on the floor and all over her face. She had a black bra wrapped around her face like a gag. There were .22 caliber shell casings that were laying on the floor there. It appeared that she'd been shot in the head execution style after she'd been tied up. So it was a horrific crime.
Maybe she had interrupted a burglar. It didn't make any sense because most burglars run when they're confronted by somebody.
As police process the house, the carpet seems to offer up some possible clues.
This was plush carpeting, and you could see that there were distinctive prints of two different sizes, a smaller one and a larger one. She was barefooted, so there was no barefoot prints that were on the carpet. We had two different suspects that we were looking at. So it could have been possible that it was two of them that were together when the murder happened.
I processed everything that I could possibly think of in hopes of finding some latent fingerprints. I processed the cabinet that the stereo was on. It appeared that whatever was touched was taken. There were some things on the kitchen table, but they didn't appear to have been disturbed. A lot of times burglars will go up and they'll put their hands on a window, shading the window so that they can see inside the house. But I was able to find nothing.
Friends say Susan Schwarz was a free spirit and a role model to her little sister.
I thought she was just the coolest kid on the block. She was so stylish and pretty. My sister was barely 5 feet tall, so she would wear these gigantic platform shoes, and she would hem her pants all the way down to the ground so you couldn't even see her feet underneath all of her clothing. She had the most beautiful reddish auburn hair, and if she would have just let it curl naturally, it would have just been gorgeous. But no, the straight hair was the thing in those days. Everybody had it down to their waist, and it had to be straight, perfectly straight to be cool. So she would go through this incredible braiding process and rubber band wrapping process on down her hair at nighttime to try to make it straight. She would take her bangs and pull them down and tape them to her head at night before she went to sleep. So you would hear her in the bathrooms in the morning ripping that tape off. Rip, ow! Rip, ow! And she'd have these red marks on her forehead after she would come out of the bathroom, and they'd slowly fade throughout breakfast and go away. But every morning she'd have those bangs taped to her forehead. She was quiet and kind. She took time to listen to me. Even though I was a lot younger than her, she never made fun of my ideas or my thoughts. That was a really big thing. She made friends, but not a lot of people in her actual inner circle, I don't think. very private person. And she had her friend, Karen.
I was a freshman, and Sue was a sophomore at the high school. We didn't know each other. We were in a class, and I turned around in my chair and started talking. And she just kind of sat there and looked at me because she was kind of like shocked. We didn't know each other. I don't know why I did it, but pretty soon we just began hanging out. And we just started to be best friends. She was very logical, where I was just out there. And she was very intelligent. She used to walk around with a book in her hand or a thesaurus. She loved to develop her vocabulary. We just enjoyed doing things, like sometimes dressing up and modeling and taking pictures of each other. And we had fun. We used to have a saying, "Let no man come between us." Nothing came between us. She was always willing to give what you needed to make things better.
When this terrible thing happened to my sister, I was 13 years old. We were starting to develop more friendship, despite just being sisters, because I wasn't just that bratty little kid. We actually could talk about stuff that we did have in common. So it was nice. It was nice. I was at school. And they came to my class and took me to the office. They didn't tell me anything. Then my mom came, and we went and got my brother, and we went home. She took us in and sat us down in the living room, and she was trying to explain to us that Sue was gone, and we didn't understand what gone meant, that she said that she had been killed, and I was just in shock. I think I just sat there crying. Our family was just devastated. Numb. They were really numb with shock.
As police scour Susan's home, something feels off, way off.
There was no ransacking. It just didn't feel right. Burglars don't go in there and shoot somebody to steal $150 worth of stereo equipment.
It's pretty unusual to have a homicide occur during the commission of a burglary, so it was a real puzzling case.
After being at the crime scene, there was no doubt in my mind that it wasn't a burglary. I don't think I've ever seen anything so depressing and so hurtful as to see a naked woman bound up with a gag stuffed in her mouth and shot in the head. I can't fathom it. It was an execution. She was killed by somebody that she knew.
The feelings that I had, it was just overwhelming terror and shock, anger, and the ever-present why. Why? Why would someone do that to her? For a 13-year-old kid, that just kind of shut me down for a while. Our family was just destroyed.
Whoever the killer was comfortable enough to walk up to the house, tie her up, put a gag in her mouth, and shoot her.
Detectives begin to question witnesses. They start with the man who found Susan's body, her boyfriend, Bill Hassler.
Sue was everything to Bill. I mean, he just worshipped her entirely.
He was very much a loner. He didn't have a lot of male friends or anything.
You had to look at the boyfriend first, Sue's boyfriend, Bill Hassler. He was very emotional, very upset when they talked to him about what happened when he came home and found her.
That poor guy, he was just like a zombie. I've never seen anyone so devastated.
Despite Bill's shock and sadness, investigators can't rule him out just yet. They interview neighbors about what they saw and heard earlier that day.
There was a person that heard what sounded like a squealing noise around 9:45 in the morning coming from the area of Sue's house. They didn't think much of it at the time. You know, if that squealing noise was when Sue was shot, it does give a time frame when the murder happened. Sue's boyfriend, Bill Hassler, had an alibi for the day. We did know at that time that he was at work, so his alibi panned out. So he was ruled out.
While police search for leads, the medical examiner conducts Susan's autopsy.
The cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds to her head. There's also lacerations to her head. The lacerations meant that it appears that she was attacked first, hit in the head, maybe would have dazed her. That would have led the person to be able to take control and then tie her up. Even though she was naked, there was no signs of a sexual assault.
Susan's murder leaves her family shocked and terrified.
Having Sue so viciously murdered in her own home robbed me of every bit of security that I think I had ever had as a kid, because home should always be safe. I was terrified that something was going to happen. I couldn't wrap my head around someone coming into her house and doing that to her. Home wasn't safe anymore.
Police shift their focus and question Karen Smith, Susan's best friend, who recently separated from her abusive husband, Gregory Johnson.
The police asked me if I knew anybody that might have something against Sue. My husband, Greg, didn't like Sue because he thought that she was trying to break us up. She didn't particularly like Greg. She just thought that he was basically an abusive type person. She didn't trust him. And she would let me know about that. Eventually, he started feeling it. He spent most of his time trying to keep me away from her because he knew that she knew what he was doing, and what he was doing was wrong. Him being physically violent with me.
The detective did go and talk to Gregory Johnson. He was cooperative. They asked him where he was on the day of the murder, and he said he was fishing. Detectives tracked down the people he was fishing with. And, memories are not that great, so the people weren't able to really verify he was there or not there. I think he remained a person of interest, but then there's really nothing else to indicate that Greg was involved.
As police struggle to find answers, Susan's 13-year-old sister takes on a grim task.
I actually was asked by Bill personally to come and take out my sister's possessions. He couldn't do it. It was not a crime scene any longer at that point, but I knew I was looking at the place where she died and at the footsteps of the people that walked through her blood as they went through her house. So, it was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. I will never, ever get rid of that memory, ever. I can't. That stays in my brain forever. Never, ever forget that memory.
For months, detectives search for Susan's killer, but without a motive or any suspects, the case stalls.
I find it extremely frustrating. There's a point at which you've run out all of your leads You've checked with everybody and you simply can't do anything else, and it becomes inactive.
I was calling the police on a regular basis there for a while, but it went cold pretty quickly. I'd say within the first 6 months, it probably started to get put away.
In 1986, there was a murder in Seattle that bore many similarities to Sue's murder. The victim was Molly McClure, and she was lying on her stomach. She had her hands tied behind her back with an electrical cord. There was a gag in her mouth. She had injuries to her head.
Police zero in on the suspect. Sherwood Knight lives in the building and has a criminal record.
Sherwood Knight had been arrested for the murder.
He killed her very much similar to the way Sue was killed.
Because of the similarities, the same person could have been responsible.
This man could have done it.
In 1986, there was a murder in Seattle. The victim was killed by Sherwood Knight.
Detectives tried to figure out if it could be related to Susan Shore's murder because the MO was very similar.
In Molly's case, she was sexually assaulted and Susan was not. But the other similarity between the two was that Sherwood Knight knew both of the women.
Police are surprised to learn that Sherwood Knight has any connection to Susan Schwartz. Knight turns out to be the half-brother of Gregory Johnson, the estranged, abusive husband of Susan's best friend, Karen.
Sherwood was familiar with Susan because she kind of traveled in the same circles as his half-brother, as Gregory Johnson.
Sherwood Knight was always nice to me. We called him Cavay. When I found out that Cavay had murdered that woman, it didn't make any sense to me. Why would he do that? What did she do to him?
We found out the connection between Sherwood Knight and Greg Johnson being half-brothers, and that Greg Johnson was married to Karen, who was Susan's best friend. We wanted to interview him that day.
Snohomish detectives track down Gregory Johnson and find him in prison, doing time for robbery. It was not the first time he had been behind bars. And Johnson has a story to tell that he says took place on the day of Susan Schwartz's murder.
He says, I was with my brother, Sherwood. I was driving him around with a couple other guys looking for a place to burglarize, and we pulled into this driveway, and the three of them went in, and they came out of the house, and Sherwood had a gun in his hand, and he says, we better not get caught for this one. And later on that night, I was watching the news on TV, and they said that Susan Shores was murdered.
Johnson implicates Sherwood Knight. But the word of a convicted criminal alone isn't enough to charge him.
Sherwood Knight was in jail because of Molly McClure's murder. He had an attorney, so he could not be interviewed about Sue's case. Even though it seemed important, there wasn't a lot to go on with Sue's case. There was still a lack of evidence.
In 1986, Sherwood Knight was convicted of a rape and murder of Molly McClure.
Knight gets life without parole, but since detectives can't connect him to Susan's murder, her case now goes colder than a winter ice storm in Washington state.
I kept wishing, I kept wanting for the person to be caught, but I think I lost hope that it would ever happen because it just went on for so long. I mean, so long. I had given up hope of ever finding out who did that to my sister, to Sue.
Snohomish County formed the cold case team in February of 2005. November of that year, Gary Schwartz told us that his sister, Susan, had been murdered in 1979, and he wanted us to work on that case. Detective Vanderweist and I went through all the evidence and had it sent off for DNA testing because there was no such thing as DNA back in 1979.
The police collected, I think, almost 100 items of evidence from the scene. And there's invariably some DNA that's going to be found.
The only DNA that came back matched Susan Schwartz. We didn't have any other different profiles.
There was no forensic evidence that helped determine who committed this crime. There was nothing.
Then a phone call to Susan's friend Karen from the mother of Gregory Johnson and Sherwood Knight adds a new mystery to the case.
Over the years, I kept contact with Greg's mom. She was the grandmother of my son. We were talking on the phone, and she said, I got this letter from Captivate or Sherwood, and I'm going to mail it to you. Sherwood Knight is a half-brother to Gregory Johnson. It was from Captivate to Greg saying, you were supposed to help me out while I'm in prison. If you don't help me out within 2 weeks, I'm going to spill the beans on you and let you see what it's been like for me all these years.
Sherwood Knight, he had some medical issues. He didn't want to die in prison. He wrote a letter kind of saying, you better come up with some money for an attorney so that I can pursue my case, or I'm going to tell the crime that you committed.
The letter was interesting because it kind of was cryptic. It didn't really say exactly what it was talking about.
It would have been something really bad. Greg was a very, very terrible person. He was abusive to me from when we got married. He's vicious. I think in the back of my mind, I felt that it had something to do with Sue's murder. I got this letter from Sherwood to Greg saying that if you don't help me out, I'm going to spill the beans on you. I didn't know what to do with the letter. I was shocked, first of all. I just put the letter to the side for 6 months because I was a little bit fearful. Greg was violent, quite violent. I came across the letter again 6 months later, and I decided, I have to do something with this letter. So that's when I decided to mail it to the Snohomish County detectives. I just didn't want the responsibility of having that letter.
There wasn't much to go on with the letter because it was very vague. It didn't specify what Sherwood was talking about when he talked about the secret. The letter did bring Sherwood Knight and Greg Johnson to the top of the list of the possible suspects.
Knight's letter to his half-brother Gregory Johnson doesn't solve the case, but it reminds Karen of all the support Susan gave her 20 years earlier, when she was struggling in an abusive marriage to Johnson.
Sue would tell me, you don't deserve this, Karen. You need to get out. You can have a better life. Sue helped me leave the first time.
Her friend Karen had stayed with her for a couple of weeks. before she was finally able to make the arrangements to get away from Greg Johnson.
She got me out of there. She helped me pack. My son, Greg Jr., was 6 months old when she helped me leave. Greg was so angry that Sue helped me leave him. 2.5 years later, when I found out that Sue was shot, I immediately went back to Washington for the funeral. I called Greg. We actually started to get back together. You have this daydream, this Cinderella dream in the back of your head that he's going to change, but the abuse just continues on. I left Greg for good around 87 or 88. That was the last time I talked to Greg.
Detectives refused to give up on finding Susan's killer. In 2009, they try an innovative tactic, hoping to jumpstart the case.
Our detective in Florida had put out a deck of cold case playing cards and put them into the prisons. And they'd solved more than 6 cases. So if I can put a different homicide on each card with a picture of the victim and put them into the prisons, then they're going to play these cards and be familiar with these cases that they're reading. On the back, it says that Crime Stoppers will pay you a reward if you call in a tip.
The hope was that somebody, in looking at these cards, would be willing to come forward.
The cases that I thought were the most innocent victims, I tried to put them on the aces and the face cards. So we put Susan Schwarz on the Queen of Hearts.
When the deck came out, I was going through and saw that she was the Queen of Hearts. It was so fitting because she was such a tiny, sweet, just big-hearted person. So it was perfect. I cried.
In 2011, Sherwood Knight was thinking about his own situation. He had been playing cards with the other inmates with these cold case cards, and he noticed the picture of Susan.
Sherwood Knight, who was serving a life sentence, said that he had information about who killed Sue Schwarz.
He told us that on the day that Susan Schwarz was murdered, he was down fishing on the pier, and Greg Johnson, his half-brother, drove up.
Greg had told him that, hey, if the police come asking about me, tell them that I was fishing with you on this day. Sherwood said that he asked him why, and Greg responded, because I killed Sue.
Sherwood said he was pretty shocked, and he could see in the car that there was a girl sitting in the front seat. If Greg had just killed Susan, maybe this girl was with him and might know something.
The police knew that Gregory Johnson had a girlfriend, but that was new information to them.
We need to figure out who that girl was.
Locating and talking to Greg's girlfriend would be crucial.
It gave us a lot of hope that we were now on the right track. I thought it was going to be the break in the case. When Sherwood Knight told us that the girlfriend was sitting in the car when Greg was telling him that he killed Susan, we felt that this girlfriend was our prime witness.
We identified her. We had located an address in the Seattle area. We were going to go and see if she had any information.
If the ex-girlfriend, known as MM, is willing to talk to police, she might have vital testimony about the case.
We immediately drove to her address to attempt to talk with her.
We arrived. She put her dogs away. She had 3 or 4 dogs. We sat down in the dining room. She was totally willing to talk about her relationship with Greg Johnson that lasted quite a while.
She confirmed that when she was 17, that she was in a relationship with Greg, that he was physically abusive to her. He choked her, he beat her up.
She was afraid of him, but she was also afraid to leave him.
She gave no indication that she had any knowledge that Greg had done any harm to Sue. After the interview, we explained to her and said, hey, listen, in the crime scene, there were some smaller footprints. So we'd like to get a DNA sample just to rule you out. When I asked her about the DNA, I could see her behavior change. I could see her get defensive, pulling her legs up close to her on the chair, and I could see that she truly seemed to be afraid. She knew something, and she said she didn't want to get involved. And she got up from the chair and said she had to put her dog out.
She gets up and she walks around the table behind me. So I got up behind her and I said, you were there, weren't you? And as she turns over her shoulder, she whispers to me, I was there. And then she says it again, I was there. And she just kind of melts into my chest, and I just give her a big hug. And I said, it's okay. It's okay. She'd been holding this secret for 32 years, and now it was going to be exposed. And you could see that it was just crushing her.
The witness, M.M., begins to describe what happened on that terrible day.
Greg said he needed to go for a ride to see somebody. So she got in the car, they pulled up to a house, he went inside, and then he came back out and said, there's somebody in the shower, you need to come with me. So she went to the house.
She observed that there was a woman taking a shower because the bathroom door was open.
Greg directed her to grab some things out of the house and bring it back to the car. She did that. She was sitting there by herself.
When he didn't come out immediately behind her, M.M. decided, I wonder if he's in there going to rape her because she's nude in the shower. She got back out and went back into the house. And she sees Greg pulling open the shower curtains and grabbing Susan, who's saying, what are you doing in my house? Get out of here. You're not supposed to be here. Leave me alone. And Greg starts beating her with the pistol that he has out in his hand. He pulls her out of the bathtub and ends up forcing her down onto the floor. And he uses this electrical cord to tie her hands behind her back. And she's face down on the floor. The girlfriend ends up watching Greg put a pillow over Susan's head, putting the gun up to the side of her head and pulling the trigger. At that point, he looks up and he sees his girlfriend is in the house and witnessing what he just did. And he shoots Susan 2 more times and then tells his girlfriend, that's what happens to people that mess with me. Don't you ever tell anybody what you saw, or I will kill you and I will kill your mother.
She took that threat very seriously and really thought that at any time if she came forward, that he would track her down.
I'm hanging on every word that she's telling us. We were just so fortunate to have that.
I was excited to sit there and have somebody as an eyewitness. It was just a great feeling. There was no doubt in our mind that she was telling us the truth. We were ecstatic. We knew it was enough to get Greg. Our next step was to go track him down. I was just thrilled that we had found somebody that was an eyewitness, which is very rare.
We knew that this one witness was enough to put Greg away for this murder.
I was eager to go track down Greg.
Gregory Johnson is no longer in prison, but the police look for his last known whereabouts.
We did locate an address for Greg down in Seattle, so myself and Detective Scharf went down to Seattle, went to his house. We saw him coming up the street, and he's eating some popcorn, just kind of casual, carefree. Greg was cooperative. He agreed to talk with us. We sat in the car, interviewing him, but he would not admit any involvement in the murder.
So Pat told him, "You're free to leave if you want to leave." And Greg kind of was nonchalant about it, and he really didn't start walking away. So I got out of the car and told him that he was under arrest for killing Susan Schwartz, and I put my handcuffs on him.
My brother called me to tell me that there had been an arrest. I think the first thing that really hit me when I received the news initially is that overwhelming sense of relief. Because there was always that fear that that person was still out there, maybe harming other people.
Initially, we charged Gregory Johnson with first-degree murder. This particular case, having occurred, 30 years earlier, I started to kind of worry because of the age of it. Are all the witnesses going to be alive? Are they all going to remember? Is there any evidence which has been lost?
The prosecution faces a tough decision: go to trial or offer Gregory Johnson a plea deal.
It made me think that a sure thing, without having to put the victim's family through what's a very traumatic experience, was the right thing to do. And so he engaged in plea negotiations with his attorney.
Anytime you go to trial, there's always the unknown. It only takes one person to have a jury to have doubt.
Gregory Johnson pled guilty to a second-degree murder charge. Our recommendation was 298 months, which is almost 25 years. The judge did follow that during the sentencing.
I wanted him in there for life. I didn't want to do any kind of a plea deal, but we didn't really have a choice. The evidence it wasn't there, and he could have ended up walking away.
In a brutal murder like what happened to Susan Schwartz, I don't think justice is ever served. I don't think there's any sentence that can make it right, that can provide justice. But I felt at the end of the day that Gregory Johnson got an appropriate sentence.
Gregory Johnson pleads guilty, but he never accepts personal responsibility for killing Susan Schwartz.
During the sentencing, he blamed Susan for what he called meddling in his relationship, when really she was just being a compassionate friend. He showed no remorse for having killed her.
She was meddling in his business. She was best friends with your wife who you were beating on. She wasn't meddling, she was being a friend.
I never imagined that Greg was capable of murder. It used to make me feel guilty that I'd ever introduced him to Sue. Now it just makes me mad.
I believe she was killed for the simple fact of helping her friend. And that's what this whole thing comes down to. And that makes it even worse for me. I am still really conflicted about the witness. Yes, I am, first and foremost, grateful to her. But I'm also frustrated with the witness because of the fact that it literally took us almost 32 years to get the information that we needed. If you have information, tell somebody. Let people know so that families like mine don't have to wonder for decades and decades who did this horrible thing to their family. I really wish we'd gotten the information sooner, a lot sooner.
Sue was special. She was just a good person, and we just don't have that many good people in this world anymore.
She just died too young. She didn't have a chance. We don't know what things she could have done. And we never will, because somebody decided to take that away from us. I miss her. I miss what could have been. I'm sorry that this happened to you. I wish I could take it back. I love you. And I'll never stop loving you.
There is a terrifying vulnerability in the sanctity of the family home. We build walls, we lock doors, and we install security systems to keep the monsters out. We teach our children to be wary of strangers, to stay close in crowds, and to never open the front door to someone they do not know. The entire foundation of a child's understanding of safety is anchored in the presence of their parents, specifically the comforting, protective embrace of a mother. But what happens when the locks on the doors are entirely useless? What happens when the threat does not arrive from the dark streets of a dangerous neighborhood, but instead originates from within the very walls meant to provide shelter? And what happens when the monster is not a stranger in the shadows, but the devastating, unseen specter of severe mental illness that has completely consumed the mind of the person whose primary biological and moral duty is to protect those children? This is the harrowing question that lies at the heart of one of the most devastating, controversial, and deeply tragic cases in the history of the American justice system. It is a story that forces us to look away from our traditional understanding of good and evil and instead stare directly into the terrifying abyss of a fractured human mind. The morning of June 20th, 2001, in Houston, Texas, began like countless other humid summer mornings in the sprawling suburban neighborhoods of the American South. The sun rose, casting its bright light over quiet streets, manicured lawns, and houses filled with families preparing for the day ahead. Inside the Yates residence, the morning routine was underway. Rusty Yates, the patriarch of the family, prepared to leave for work. His wife, Andrea Yates, remained at home with their 5 young children. The children ranged in age from a vulnerable 6 months old to an energetic 7 years old. They were the center of the household, a bustling, chaotic, and presumably loving environment. When Rusty walked out the door to begin his commute, he left behind a domestic scene that appeared entirely ordinary to the outside world. He also left with the knowledge that his mother was scheduled to arrive shortly to help Andrea care for the children, a precaution taken due to Andrea's ongoing struggles with her mental health. There was only a brief window of time where Andrea would be completely alone with her 5 children. It was a span of roughly 1 hour between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning. In the grand scheme of a lifetime, 60 minutes is a fleeting moment, a negligible fraction of a day that usually passes without consequence. But on this specific morning in Houston, those 60 minutes would become a profound and bottomless eternity, a window of time during which the unimaginable would unfold, forever altering the lives of everyone involved and sending a massive shockwave through the conscience of an entire nation. As the sound of Rusty's car faded into the distance, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the Yates home. Inside that house were 5 innocent lives: Paul, who was just 3 years old; Luke, who was 5; John, who was 7; the fragile infant, Mary, who had been in this world for a mere 6 months; and Noah, the eldest, who was also 7 years old. These children were entirely dependent on the woman who was now the only adult in the house. They looked to her for nourishment, for comfort, and for ultimate safety. They had no reason to fear the water running in the family bathtub. They had no capacity to understand that the mother they loved was currently drowning in a sea of severe, untreated postpartum psychosis and deep schizophrenic delusions. Andrea Yates was not acting out of malice or sudden, inexplicable hatred for the children she had brought into the world. Instead, her mind had been completely hijacked by a deeply disturbed, terrifyingly warped reality. For years, a storm had been brewing inside her brain, a storm characterized by profound depression, terrifying hallucinations, and apocalyptic religious delusions. In the quiet isolation of that morning hour, the storm finally broke, devastating everything in its path. The bathtub, a mundane fixture associated with the nightly routine of washing away the day's dirt, washing hair, and playing with toys, was transformed into an altar of unthinkable tragedy. Andrea began the methodical, horrifying process of drowning her children. She started with the younger boys, Paul, Luke, and John. The sheer physical reality of this act is almost too agonizing to comprehend. These were children who trusted her implicitly, children whose natural instinct when distressed would be to reach out for their mother, only to find that she was the source of their demise. After the boys, she took the life of baby Mary, a 6-month-old infant completely defenseless against the overwhelming force of the water and the distorted determination of the woman holding her under. The profound tragedy reached its most agonizing peak with Noah, the oldest child. Noah walked into the bathroom and witnessed the unthinkable. He saw his baby sister in the water. He saw his mother. And in a desperate, heartbreaking moment of primal terror and realization, the 7-year-old boy turned and ran. He tried to flee from the person who had given him life, running through the halls of the only home he had ever known. But the house offered no escape, and the doors were closed to the outside world. Andrea pursued her terrified son, catching him and bringing him back to the bathroom, where he suffered the exact same fate as his siblings, dying right next to the lifeless body of his little sister. What followed this chaotic, horrific sequence of events was a chilling, surreal quiet. The house was still. The energetic noises of 5 young boys and a baby girl were permanently silenced. Operating under a terrifying calmness born of her deep psychosis, Andrea took the small, lifeless bodies of 4 of her children and carried them into the bedroom. She laid them down on the bed, side by side, in a gesture that starkly highlights the agonizing paradox of her mental state, a bizarre intersection of maternal caretaking and absolute destruction. She carefully pulled a blanket over them, covering their faces as if tucking them in for a long, deep sleep. Noah, the oldest, who had tried so desperately to escape, was left behind in the bathtub. After arranging her children, Andrea did not attempt to flee. She did not attempt to hide what she had done, nor did she try to end her own life in that immediate moment. Instead, her actions demonstrated a complex, deeply fractured awareness of reality. She picked up the telephone and dialed 911. She spoke to the dispatcher, calmly stating that she needed police officers and an ambulance to come to her home. Following that, she made a second phone call. She called Rusty, the husband who had left less than an hour prior, and told him that he needed to come home immediately. When he asked why, the devastating reality of the situation remained unspoken, but the urgency was absolute. This tragic morning in Houston was not a sudden, unpredictable explosion of violence out of clear blue sky. It was the catastrophic climax of a long, painful, and documented descent into severe mental illness. It was the devastating result of postpartum depression morphing into full-blown postpartum psychosis, a condition so severe that it entirely severed Andrea's connection to reality. In her mind, heavily clouded by severe religious delusions, she was not committing an act of evil. In her distorted reality, she genuinely believed she was a terrible, failing mother who had been corrupted by demonic forces. She harbored the terrifying conviction that her children were inherently doomed, destined to burn in hell for eternity if they were allowed to grow up under her corrupted influence. The drowning, in the darkest, most twisted corners of her psychotic mind, was perceived not as murder, but as a desperate, ultimate act of salvation. She believed she was ensuring their souls would return to heaven while they were still innocent. This horrifying disconnect between the physical reality of her actions and the internal, psychological motivation behind them forms the absolute core of the tragedy. When the police arrived at the Yates residence, they were met with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Experienced investigators, seasoned medical examiners, and hardened detectives who had seen the worst of human behavior were brought to their knees by the sight of the 5 children and the quiet, deeply disturbed woman who had taken their lives. The incident immediately captivated and horrified the entire nation. The faces of the 5 children were broadcast across every news network, their innocent smiles contrasting violently with the grim reality of their final moments. But as the initial shock began to subside, a fierce, deeply polarizing debate began to emerge. The story of Andrea Yates could not be easily categorized into a simple narrative of a malicious murderer. It demanded a grueling, uncomfortable examination of mental health, specifically the severely neglected and misunderstood realm of maternal mental illness. It demanded that society look closely at how the medical system handles warnings of severe psychiatric distress, and it forced the legal system into a highly publicized, agonizing confrontation with its own definitions of sanity and responsibility. The ensuing legal battles would span years and multiple trials, turning the Yates family tragedy into a major turning point in American jurisprudence. The case would strictly test the boundaries of the Manhattan Rule, a legal standard used in Texas to determine insanity based solely on whether the defendant knew their actions were right or wrong at the exact moment of the crime. The prosecution would argue that Andrea's deliberate actions, waiting for her husband to leave, calling the police, understanding the finality of drowning, proved she knew her actions were illegal and therefore wrong. The defense, however, would counter with the profound argument that while she may have known the act was illegal under the laws of man, her severe psychosis convinced her it was absolutely righteous and necessary under the laws of God. This profound clash between a rigid legal framework and the chaotic, unquantifiable nature of severe mental illness would keep the nation deeply divided. To understand the full scope of this tragedy, we must carefully peel back the layers of the years leading up to that terrible morning in June. We must examine the missed medical warnings, the agonizing hospitalizations, the powerful medications, and the immense, overwhelming pressure of raising 5 young children while battling a mind that was constantly betraying itself. We must look at the victims with profound empathy, honoring the brief lives of Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary, while also attempting to comprehend the unfathomable darkness that consumed their mother. The story of the Yates family is a descent into the most terrifying aspects of the human condition, a journey that forces us to question our definitions of justice, our capacity for compassion, and our understanding of the fragile line that separates sanity from absolute devastation. As we trace the timeline of Andrea Yates' life, the medical interventions that failed her, the horrific details of the incident itself, and the grueling courtroom dramas that followed, we are left to grapple with a tragedy where there are no clear villains, only an abundance of profound, heartbreaking loss. This is not just a story about how 5 children died. It is a critical, unflinching examination of why they died and the massive systemic and psychological failures that paved the way to that quiet, deadly morning in Texas. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded within the walls of the Yates home, one must first look at the lives that inhabited that space before the darkness consumed it completely. A home with 5 young children is a universe unto itself. It is a place of constant motion, unrelenting demands, echoing laughter, and an overwhelming amount of life. The Yates household was precisely this kind of universe, revolving around the absolute dependence and vibrant energy of 5 distinct young souls. At the center of this world were the children, innocent and entirely unaware of the psychological storm gathering just above them. There was Paul, a 3-year-old boy whose world was defined by the simple joys of early childhood, a time when every object is a discovery and every room is an adventure. Paul was navigating that delicate stage between being a toddler and a little boy, requiring constant supervision and endless patience. Above him was Luke, who was 5 years old. At 5, a child is beginning to piece together the mechanics of the world, asking endless questions and forming a distinct personality filled with curiosity and boundless energy. Then there were the 2 7-year-olds, John and Noah. Being the eldest, they were the leaders of this small pack of siblings. At 7 years old, boys are deeply immersed in the world of imagination, brotherhood, and play. They are old enough to understand basic rules and routines, but still incredibly young, completely reliant on the structure and safety provided by their parents. Noah, as the very oldest, likely carried that invisible mantle of the big brother, a role that often comes with a natural instinct to watch over the younger ones. And finally, there was the newest addition to this bustling household, the infant Mary. At merely 6 months old, Mary was entirely defenseless, a fragile infant whose entire existence depended on the nurturing touch, the feeding, and the protective embrace of her mother. She was the final piece of the family puzzle, a baby girl born into a house full of boys, a symbol of new life that tragically became the catalyst for unimaginable destruction. These 5 children were not merely statistics or names on a police report. They were vibrant, living beings who trusted their environment implicitly. Their world was their home, their father Rusty, and their mother Andrea. They looked to Andrea for everything. In the eyes of a child, a mother is not just a caregiver. She is the sun around which their entire universe orbits. She is the source of comfort when they fall, the source of warmth when they are cold, and the ultimate barrier between them and the fears of the outside world. The children had no capacity to understand that the very barrier meant to protect them was crumbling from within. They could not see the invisible, devastating illness that was slowly entirely rewriting their mother's reality. They only knew her as their mother, and their love and reliance on her were absolute and unconditional. To understand how a mother could become the instrument of her own children's demise, one must carefully and objectively examine the terrifying descent of Andrea Yates. Her actions on that June morning were not born of a sudden, inexplicable rage, nor were they the result of a malicious, evil nature carefully plotting destruction. The reality is far more complex and far more tragic. Andrea Yates was a woman drowning in the deepest, most terrifying waters of severe mental illness. Her mind, the very organ responsible for reasoning, compassion, and reality testing, had been completely hijacked by a disease that she could not control. The seeds of this tragedy were sown long before the morning of the incident, taking root deeply within the exhausting, demanding years of serial pregnancies and the overwhelming pressures of raising a rapidly growing family. The turning point in Andrea's mental health, the definitive moment when the shadows began to overtake the light, occurred after the birth of her 4th child in the year 1999. It was then that she began to exhibit severe, debilitating symptoms of postpartum depression that rapidly mutated into something far more dangerous: postpartum psychosis. This is a crucial distinction that must be made clear. Postpartum psychosis is not simply an extreme form of the baby blues. It is not just the exhaustion, crying spells, and mood swings that many new mothers experience. It is a severe, life-threatening psychiatric emergency characterized by a complete and total break from reality. For Andrea, this break manifested in the most terrifying ways imaginable. The mother who was supposed to be bonding with her new baby was instead plunging into a dark, distorted abyss where her own thoughts became her worst enemy. In the years following the birth of her 4th child, the severity of her condition became impossible to ignore. The psychological torment she endured was so immense, so agonizing, that she actively sought to end her own life. She made two separate, devastating suicide attempts, actions that clearly signaled a mind in absolute crisis, crying out for relief from an unbearable internal pain. These attempts were stark, terrifying warnings that Andrea was no longer safe, not just to herself, but potentially to those entirely dependent upon her. Consequently, she endured multiple hospitalizations in psychiatric facilities. The medical system attempted to intervene, recognizing the profound danger of her condition. She was prescribed and administered powerful antipsychotic medications, heavy drugs designed to suppress the terrifying hallucinations and anchor her shattered mind back to reality. Her life became a grueling cycle of deep depressive episodes, terrifying psychotic breaks, institutionalization, heavy medication, and then returning home to a house full of young, demanding children. It was during these periods of psychiatric intervention that medical professionals issued a stark, unequivocal warning to both Andrea and her husband Rusty. The psychiatrists, observing the devastating toll that childbirth and postpartum hormonal shifts had taken on her fragile mental state, explicitly warned the couple against having any more children. The medical consensus was clear and deeply concerning. Another pregnancy would pose a severe, almost guaranteed threat to her sanity and her life. The doctors recognized that her mind simply could not withstand the biological and psychological trauma of another postpartum period. It was a professional, desperate plea for prevention, a medical red flag raised to stop a clearly visible catastrophe from unfolding. Tragically, deeply unfortunately, this explicit medical warning was ultimately ignored. Whether driven by deep religious convictions regarding family planning, a tragic underestimation of the disease's power, or a fatalistic denial of the risks, the couple conceived again. The birth of the fifth child, baby Mary, set the final, inescapable stage for the tragedy. The introduction of another infant into an environment already strained to the breaking point by severe mental illness was the catalyst that pushed Andrea past the point of no return. The exact scenario the doctors had feared and warned against materialized with devastating speed and intensity. Following Mary's birth, Andrea's mind did not just slip, it completely shattered. The psychosis that took hold of Andrea Yates was not a random chaos. It was highly structured around deep, terrifying religious delusions. This is perhaps the most agonizing and difficult aspect of the case to comprehend. In her deeply sick mind, religion and motherhood became horribly intertwined with delusions of damnation and evil. Andrea developed a fixed, unshakable belief that she was an inherently bad mother, a failure of a human being who was fundamentally corrupting her children. This was not just a feeling of inadequacy. It was a profound, hallucinatory conviction. She believed that she was literally possessed by demonic forces, that the devil himself had taken residence within her, and that this evil was actively poisoning the souls of Paul, Luke, John, Noah, and baby Mary. In her twisted, psychotic reality, she saw a future for her children that was worse than death. She became absolutely convinced that because she was raising them, they were destined to become evil, to fail in the eyes of God, and ultimately, to be condemned to burn in the fires of hell for all eternity. The weight of this delusion is impossible for a healthy mind to fully grasp. She was a mother looking at her beloved children and seeing them on a direct, unavoidable path to eternal suffering, all because of her own perceived demonic inadequacy. This terrifying belief system formed the grim, inescapable logic of her actions. Driven by this profound religious delusion, the act of taking their lives morphed in her diseased mind from an act of unspeakable violence into a desperate, necessary act of supreme maternal sacrifice. She believed that by drowning them while they were still young, still pure, and still innocent, she could bypass the corruption of the world and her own demonic influence. She believed that ending their mortal lives was the absolute only way to guarantee the salvation of their eternal souls. In the darkest, most terrifying depths of postpartum psychosis, Andrea Yates did not drown her children out of hatred. She drowned them because her completely shattered reality convinced her it was the only way to save them from a fate she believed was far worse. This terrifying intersection of profound love, absolute delusion, and horrific action is what makes the portrait of the Yates family so devastating. The victims were innocent children who simply wanted to play, to grow, and to be loved by their mother. The perpetrator was a woman who was entirely consumed by a disease that turned her maternal instincts into a weapon of mass destruction. The background of this case is not a story of domestic violence in the traditional sense, nor is it a tale of a cold, calculating killer. It is a slow-moving, agonizing medical and psychological disaster. It is the story of a mind breaking under pressure, of medical warnings left unheeded, and of a family structure that completely collapsed under the unbearable weight of untreated, highly aggressive psychotic delusions. As the days ticked closer to the 20th of June, the invisible storm inside Andrea's head grew to a fever pitch, preparing to unleash a torrent of devastation upon the 5 innocent lives that were entirely at her mercy, leading directly to the quiet, deadly morning where all remaining tethers to reality would finally snap. The morning of June 20th, 2001, arrived with a heavy sense of ordinary routine that would soon be shattered beyond all recognition. The timeline of this specific day is agonizingly narrow, completely confined within a single hour that permanently altered the fabric of reality for the Yates family. It was a brief, tragic window of time stretching from approximately 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock in the morning. Rusty Yates, following his usual morning schedule, gathered his belongings, stepped out of the front door, and made his way to his vehicle to begin his commute to work. He left the house under the assumption that his departure was merely a temporary transition. It had been previously arranged that his mother, Andrea's mother-in-law, would be arriving shortly after his departure to assist with the overwhelming task of managing 5 young children. This arrangement was not a casual convenience. It was a desperately needed, deliberately planned safety measure, a clear acknowledgement of the severe, lingering shadows that clouded Andrea's mental state. The plan was designed to ensure that Andrea would never be left entirely alone with the children for an extended period. However, between the moment Rusty's car disappeared down the suburban street and the anticipated moment his mother would knock on the front door, a fatal gap existed. It was a gap of roughly 60 minutes. In the vast continuum of human existence, an hour is practically nothing, a minor increment of passing time. But within the walls of that Houston home, surrounded by the deceptive tranquility of a summer morning, those 60 minutes became an eternity of unspeakable horror, providing the exact span of isolation required for a deeply fractured mind to execute a devastating and irreversible plan. As the front door clicked shut and the sound of the departing engine faded into the distance, a profound, suffocating silence descended upon the interior of the house. The residence was occupied by 5 vibrant, innocent children, yet a chilling stillness began to take hold. Andrea Yates was now the sole authority, the only adult presence, and the absolute guardian of the environment. But the woman standing in that house was no longer operating under the normal protective parameters of motherhood. Her severe postpartum psychosis, fueled by terrifying, apocalyptic religious delusions, had entirely consumed her consciousness. In her severely distorted perception, the house was not a sanctuary. It was a holding cell for souls destined for eternal damnation. She believed with absolute, terrifying certainty that she was a vessel of evil, and that her children were inextricably doomed unless she intervened with the ultimate, tragic sacrifice. Guided by this horrific internal logic, she walked into the family bathroom. The sound of rushing water soon broke the silence of the home as she turned the faucet, allowing the heavy, porcelain bathtub to slowly fill. The sound of a bathtub filling is typically associated with comfort, warmth, and the soothing rituals of childhood hygiene. On this morning, however, it was the sound of an impending, methodical devastation. The water rising in the tub was the physical manifestation of the dark, psychotic flood that had completely overtaken her mind. The sequence of the tragedy was executed with a chilling, methodical precision that heavily contrasted with the chaotic nature of the illness driving it. The chronological order of the victims paints a picture of unimaginable heartbreak. Andrea began this horrific process with her middle children, focusing first on the younger boys before moving to the eldest and the infant. The first to be taken into the bathroom was little Paul, who was only 3 years old. At 3, a child possesses no concept of mortality and harbors absolute, unquestioning trust in their parents. Paul would have had no reason to resist his mother, no instinct to flee from the woman who had nurtured him since birth. The details of the physical act are deeply agonizing to consider, representing the ultimate betrayal of the most sacred biological bond. Following Paul, she brought in Luke, who was 5 years old, and then John, who was 7. Each boy, entirely dependent on their mother for safety, was subjected to the same terrifying, watery fate. The process was not an explosion of frenzied rage. It was a deliberate, purposeful sequence driven by a mind completely detached from reality. With each life taken, the house grew quieter, the vibrant energy of the young boys permanently extinguished beneath the surface of the water. The psychological weight of these consecutive acts is almost impossible to fathom. After John, the bathtub held the tragic evidence of a completely shattered family, yet the devastating mission dictated by her psychosis was still not entirely complete. Andrea then turned her attention to the most vulnerable member of the household, the infant girl, Mary. Mary was only 6 months old, a tiny, fragile life completely incapable of comprehending the world around her, let alone defending herself against it. She was entirely at the mercy of the hands that held her. Andrea brought the infant into the bathroom, a room that had now become a localized epicenter of unimaginable tragedy. The act of drowning a 6-month-old baby forces anyone examining this case to confront the absolute, terrifying power of severe mental illness. It demonstrates how completely a psychiatric disease can eradicate the deepest, most primal maternal instincts, replacing them with a warped, highly destructive directive. In Andrea's deeply delusional state, the infant Mary was not a baby being murdered. She was a pure soul being desperately rescued from a future of inevitable corruption and hellfire. The water claimed the life of the youngest child, adding another layer of profound darkness to the 60-minute window of isolation. But the most chaotic and perhaps most heartbreaking moment of the morning was yet to unfold, involving the oldest child who had briefly managed to evade the initial sequence of events. Noah, the 7-year-old eldest brother, had been moving about the house. He was old enough to possess a degree of independent mobility and awareness. At some point during this horrific timeline, Noah walked into the family bathroom. The scene he encountered upon crossing that threshold is something that defies all bounds of childhood comprehension. He saw his mother, the central figure of his young life, standing by the bathtub. And within the water of that tub, he saw the lifeless body of his 6-month-old baby sister, Mary. At 7 years old, Noah might not have understood the complex psychological forces at play, but he possessed the primal, instinctual capacity to recognize immediate, profound danger. He witnessed a sight that instantly shattered his fundamental understanding of safety. In a desperate, deeply tragic moment of terror, the young boy turned and ran. He fled from the bathroom, desperately sprinting through the familiar hallways and rooms of the house he had grown up in, tried to escape the incomprehensible threat that had materialized within his own home. He was a frightened child running for his life, seeking refuge in an environment that offered absolutely none. The doors were closed, the windows were shut, and the only other person in the house was the very source of his terror. The pursuit that followed is a chilling testament to the completely uncompromising nature of Andrea's delusions. Her psychotic conviction that all her children must die to be saved propelled her forward. She did not stop. She did not hesitate upon seeing her eldest son's sheer terror. She chased the terrified 7-year-old boy through the house. The physical reality of a mother relentlessly hunting down her fleeing child through their own home is the darkest, most agonizing chapter of this entire narrative. She eventually caught him, overpowering his desperate attempts to escape. She dragged him back down the hallway, back toward the bathroom that he had so frantically tried to flee. Despite his struggles and his profound fear, he was ultimately forced into the same water. Andrea drowned Noah, her firstborn son, right next to the small, lifeless body of his infant sister, Mary. The fight for survival ended in the tragic, absolute stillness of the water, marking the completion of the horrific directive issued by her severely diseased mind. The 60-minute window had closed, and 5 innocent lives had been thoroughly and permanently extinguished. What followed the violent, chaotic culmination of these acts was a bizarre, profoundly unsettling period of calm organization. The frantic energy of the pursuit and the struggle subsided, replaced by a surreal, deliberate quiet. Operating under a deeply fractured sense of domestic duty intertwined with the aftermath of her fatal actions, Andrea began to meticulously move the bodies of her children. She carefully lifted the small, wet forms of Paul, Luke, John, and the infant Mary out of the bathtub. She carried them, one by one or perhaps together, into the master bedroom. She laid them down upon the large bed, arranging them side by side in a heartbreaking tableau of lost innocence. In a gesture that completely defies logical comprehension but perfectly illustrates the agonizing paradox of her mental state, she then pulled a blanket up and over them. She covered them completely, hiding their faces, tucking them into the bed as if she were simply putting them down for a collective, peaceful afternoon nap. This act of covering them highlights the terrifying intersection of nurturing mother and instrument of death, a duality that existed solely within the confines of her severe psychosis. Noah, however, was not moved to the bedroom. The 7-year-old boy who had tried so desperately to run was left exactly where he had perished, remaining submerged in the bathtub, a silent testament to his tragic final struggle. With the physical acts completed and the scene arranged according to the dictates of her shattered reality, Andrea Yates did not attempt to clean the house, nor did she attempt to flee into the surrounding neighborhood. She did not try to hide the evidence of what had occurred, nor did she immediately attempt to take her own life to escape the consequences. Instead, she took deliberate, communicative actions that would later become the absolute focal point of massive legal debates regarding her sanity. She walked to the telephone and dialed 911. When the emergency dispatcher answered, Andrea spoke with a chilling, flat calmness, a tone utterly devoid of the hysteria one would expect. She simply stated that she needed police officers and an ambulance to be dispatched to her home address immediately. She did not provide the gruesome details of why they were needed, only that their presence was required. Immediately after terminating the call with emergency services, she dialed a second number. She called her husband, Rusty, at his workplace. When he answered, she spoke with the same eerie, detached urgency, telling him that he needed to come home right now. When Rusty, likely confused and mildly alarmed, asked her why she was making this sudden demand, she refused to elaborate. She did not confess to the unspeakable tragedy that had just occurred. She simply reiterated the urgent necessity of his immediate return. The calls were made, the receivers were hung up, and Andrea Yates sat in the quiet, devastating aftermath of the storm, waiting for the outside world to arrive and discover the unimaginable horror that had unfolded during those 60 fatal minutes. The arrival of emergency services at the Yates residence on that fateful morning transformed a quiet suburban house into the epicenter of a chilling, unforgettable crime scene. Police cruisers pulled up to the curb with their lights flashing, followed closely by an ambulance, their operators responding to the vague and urgent distress call made by Andrea. The officers who stepped out of their vehicles and walked toward the front door had no prior warning of the profound horror waiting for them inside. They expected a domestic crisis, perhaps a medical emergency or a severe psychological breakdown. but nothing in their extensive training or professional experience could have adequately prepared them for the grim reality that crossed their path the moment they entered the house. Upon stepping inside, they were met by Andrea herself, who stood quietly, her demeanor remarkably calm and composed in a way that felt entirely unnatural given the circumstances. She did not resist, she did not scream, and she did not attempt to flee. She simply surrendered her freedom with a chilling passivity, directing the officers to the areas of the home where the devastating consequences of the past hour lay concealed. The investigation began immediately, turning into a meticulous and agonizing process as detectives, crime scene technicians, and medical examiners moved through the house. Every room held a piece of the puzzle, yet the physical evidence was so deeply intertwined with psychological tragedy that the traditional framework of criminal investigation began to blur. In the master bedroom, investigators pulled back the blanket on the bed and were confronted with the sight of the four youngest children, Paul, Luke, John, and infant Mary, laid out side by side. The horrifying paradox of the scene, the careful arrangement of the bodies coupled with the absolute finality of their deaths, sent shockwaves through the hardened detectives. In the bathroom, the investigation revealed the final resting place of Noah, the eldest son, who still lay near the tub where his desperate bid for survival had been tragically cut short. Forensic teams worked in heavy silence, collecting fingerprints, taking photographs, and documenting every physical detail of the bathroom and the bedroom. They gathered the wet clothing, analyzed the water levels, and mapped out the exact movements of the morning. Every piece of physical evidence confirmed the sequence of events, establishing beyond a doubt that Andrea had systematically taken the lives of her 5 children within that narrow, 60-minute window of isolation. Yet, as the criminal investigators meticulously gathered physical proofs, the true complexity of the case began to reveal itself, introducing a profound and difficult knot that detectives and prosecutors would have to untangle. This was not a murder investigation driven by traditional criminal motives. There was no financial gain, no history of physical abuse, no bitter custody dispute, and no external enemy. The perpetrator was the mother herself, a woman with a heavily documented medical history of severe psychiatric illness, hospitalizations, and suicide attempts. The investigative focus quickly shifted from merely proving what happened to understanding why it happened, dragging the inquiry deep into the labyrinth of Andrea's shattered mind. Detectives began compiling medical records, interviewing psychiatrists who had treated her, and gathering testimonies from family members who had witnessed her gradual, agonizing deterioration over the preceding years. The investigation uncovered a tragic paper trail of missed warnings, heavy antipsychotic medications, and repeated desperate pleas from medical professionals who had explicitly stated that Andrea was a danger to herself and entirely incapable of weathering the stress of further pregnancies. The investigative interviews with Rusty Yates and other family members provided a heartbreaking window into the domestic pressure cooker that preceded the tragedy. Rusty recounted the exhausting daily routine of managing 5 young children while dealing with Andrea's recurring, debilitating bouts of depression and psychosis. Witnesses described a woman who had become increasingly detached from reality, consumed by obsessive, apocalyptic religious fears, and utterly convinced that she was failing her moral duty as a mother. As the investigators dug deeper, a fascinating and legally explosive contradiction emerged at the heart of the case. On one hand, Andrea's actions immediately following the crime, waiting for her husband to leave, isolating the children, systematically drowning them, and then methodically calling 911 and her husband, demonstrated a clear, cognitive awareness of the sequence of actions and a certain degree of operational calculation. The prosecution would later seize upon these very actions as proof that she knew what she was doing and understood the legal consequences of her behavior. On the other hand, the investigative files painted the vivid portrait of a woman who was living in an absolute nightmare of religious delusions, genuinely believing that she was saving her children from hellfire by ending their mortal lives. This tension between cognitive awareness of physical actions and total detachment from moral reality formed the central knot of the investigative process. The police and prosecutors were forced to operate at the intersection of criminal law and severe clinical psychiatry. They had to evaluate whether a person who calls the police to report a crime can truly be considered legally insane, while simultaneously acknowledging that the internal motivation driving the crime was rooted in a severe, unshakable psychotic hallucination. The investigation was not merely about securing a conviction. It was about navigating a profoundly gray area of human suffering where traditional definitions of guilt and innocence threatened to collapse entirely. As the physical evidence was cataloged, the autopsy reports were finalized, and a massive stack of psychiatric evaluations was compiled, the case moved inexorably from the quiet, tragic confines of the Houston home toward the public battleground of the courtroom, where the nation would be forced to confront the terrifying reality of postpartum psychosis and the limits of the legal system's understanding of a broken mind. The transition from the quiet horrors of the crime scene and the exhaustive gathering of medical files to the brightly lit, highly public arena of the courtroom marked the beginning of a legal battle that would profoundly challenge the American judicial system. The trials of Andrea Yates were not merely legal proceedings designed to assign guilt and determine a sentence. They evolved into a deeply polarized national debate on the definition of sanity, the responsibilities of the mentally ill, and the true legal weight of severe postpartum psychosis. When the case finally opened for its first major trial in the year 2002, the courtroom was packed with journalists, legal scholars, medical professionals, and onlookers, all drawn by the grim and perplexing nature of the tragedy. The prosecution faced the immense task of presenting the horrific reality of 5 young children drowned by their own mother, while the defense undertook the grueling responsibility of explaining a mind so utterly broken by disease that traditional concepts of criminality ceased to apply. The atmosphere inside the courthouse was charged with tension, reflecting a society deeply divided over how to judge a mother who had committed the unthinkable while trapped inside an absolute psychological nightmare. The legal framework governing the first trial was anchored firmly in the strict statutes of the state of Texas, which relied heavily upon the historic Manhattan Rule to determine legal insanity. Under this rigid standard, a defendant could only be legally absolved of responsibility for a crime if it could be definitively proven that, at the exact moment of the act, severe mental disease or defect left them entirely incapable of knowing that their conduct was wrong. This distinction between knowing an act is legally wrong versus knowing it is morally wrong according to a delusional belief system became the defining battleground of the courtroom. The prosecution aggressively argued that Andrea's actions leading up to and immediately following the tragedy demonstrated a clear consciousness of guilt and a strong awareness of right and wrong. Prosecutors emphasized that she deliberately waited for her husband to leave for work, ensuring she had the necessary window of isolation. They pointed to the systematic, calculated nature of drowning the children one by one and highlighted her calm demeanor when calling emergency services and urging her husband to return home. To the state, these actions were the undeniable hallmarks of a cold, calculating mind that understood precisely what it was doing and knew that society would view it as a crime. They presented her as a woman who broke the law and therefore deserved to face the full, unyielding weight of legal punishment. The defense team countered this narrative by presenting an overwhelming array of medical evidence, psychiatric testimonies, and detailed documentations of Andrea's long, agonizing history of severe mental illness, hospitalizations, and suicide attempts. Expert witnesses testified extensively about the terrifying reality of postpartum psychosis, explaining to the jury how Andrea's mind had been entirely captured by deep, unshakable religious delusions. The defense argued that while Andrea may have technically known that drowning her children violated the laws of man and would be deemed illegal, her severe psychosis had so completely warped her perception of reality that she genuinely believed her actions were morally righteous and absolutely necessary under the laws of God to save her children from eternal damnation. In her deeply diseased perception, she was not committing a malicious murder. She was performing an ultimate, agonizing sacrifice to protect their souls from hellfire. However, under the strict wording of the Manhattan Rule in Texas, proving that a defendant acted out of religious delusion was a monumental hurdle if the state could successfully argue that she still understood the physical nature and illegality of the act. The jury deliberated under the immense weight of this complex, emotionally exhausting testimony, forced away the horrific physical reality of the crime against the invisible, devastating machinery of a severely fractured brain. The verdict delivered at the conclusion of that first trial in 2002 reflected the difficulty of the legal standard and the profound shock of the jury. The panel rejected the defense plea of insanity and found Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. The courtroom held its breath as the sentencing phase arrived, awaiting the decision on whether she would face the ultimate penalty of execution or spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. Ultimately, the jury chose life over death, sentencing Andrea to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. While the sentence spared her life, the verdict left legal scholars, psychiatrists, and human rights advocates deeply unsettled. It signaled a profound friction between modern psychiatric understanding of severe mental illness and a rigid, unforgiving legal framework that struggled to accommodate the nuances of a mind entirely detached from reality. The conviction felt like a resolution to those demanding strict accountability for the physical acts, but it felt like a tragic miscarriage of justice to those who recognized that a severely psychotic woman had been condemned for symptoms of a disease she could not control. Yet, the legal journey of Andrea Yates was far from over, and the initial verdict was destined to unravel due to a critical error that exposed deep flaws in the handling of expert testimony. In the years following her conviction, appellate attorneys and legal analysts closely scrutinized the trial records, uncovering a significant and deeply damaging misstatement made by a key expert witness for the prosecution. During the first trial, Dr. Park Dietz, a prominent forensic psychiatrist testifying for the state, had informed the jury that shortly before the murders, an episode of the television crime drama Law and Order had aired featuring a storyline about a mother who drowned her children in a bathtub and was subsequently acquitted by reason of insanity. Dr. Dietz suggested to the jury that Andrea may have been influenced by this fictional depiction. However, as investigators and appellate teams later discovered through rigorous fact-checking, no such episode of Law and Order had ever existed or been broadcast prior to the killings. The expert witness had provided completely false information to the court, introducing a fabricated piece of circumstantial evidence that could easily have swayed the jury's perception of Andrea's premeditation and state of mind. This startling revelation provided strong grounds for an appeal, forcing the legal system to confront the integrity of the original verdict. In 2005, the Texas Court of Appeals formally overturned Andrea's conviction, ruling that the false testimony regarding the non-existent television episode had a potentially prejudicial impact on the jury's deliberations and could not be considered harmless error. The ruling meant that the verdict was completely wiped away, and the case was ordered to be sent back for a brand new trial. This development thrust the tragic narrative back into the public spotlight, forcing the legal system, the grieving family, and the nation to prepare to relive the agonizing details once more. The upcoming retrial represented a second chance for the courts to evaluate the intersection of severe mental illness and criminal responsibility, free from the tainted testimony that had compromised the integrity of the first proceeding. The legal teams on both sides began the immense task of preparing their arguments for a new jury, knowing that the stakes were just as high and the societal divisions just as deep as they had been 4 years prior. When the retrial finally commenced in the summer of 2006, the legal landscape had shifted, and the presentation of evidence placed an even greater emphasis on the undeniable severity of Andrea's psychiatric condition at the time of the tragedy. Medical experts once again took the stand, detailing the harrowing depth of her postpartum psychosis, her profound detachment from reality, and the overwhelming consensus of psychiatrists who had treated her before and after the incident. The defense meticulously walked the new bursa of jurors through the precise mechanics of her religious delusions, reinforcing the reality that her mind was entirely hijacked by a disease that completely blinded her to the moral wrongness of her actions, even if she understood the physical mechanics of what she was doing. The prosecution, while still tasked with representing the state, faced a much more receptive environment for understanding the complexities of severe mental illness in the wake of the overturned conviction and the extensive public discourse that had occurred in the intervening years. The culmination of the 2006 retrial brought a historic and profoundly different legal resolution to the case. After careful and deliberative consideration of the extensive psychiatric evidence, the new jury reached a verdict that fundamentally acknowledged the total destruction of Andrea's mental faculties. They found Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. This verdict did not mean she was set free to walk the streets. Rather, it legally recognized that her horrific actions were the direct result of a severe, uncontrollable psychiatric disease rather than criminal malice. In accordance with the law for defendants acquitted on grounds of insanity, Andrea was immediately remanded to the custody of the state mental health system. She was ordered to be placed into secure psychiatric care, specifically committed to the Kerrville State Hospital in Texas, where she would receive continuous medical evaluation and treatment. This definitive legal conclusion closed the courtroom doors on the Yates tragedy, transitioning the narrative from the aggressive battles of prosecution and defense into a quiet, institutional reality centered entirely on long-term psychiatric confinement and the ongoing, complex management of a profoundly broken mind. The final chapter of the Andrea Yates tragedy does not close with the banging of a courtroom gavel or the delivery of a definitive legal verdict, but rather extends into a quiet, lifelong existence defined by institutional confinement and ongoing psychological management. When Andrea was remanded to the custody of the Texas mental health system following her acquittal by reason of insanity in 2006, she entered a world far removed from the glaring lights of media scrutiny, public outrage, and intense legal battles. She was placed within the secure confines of the Kerrville State Hospital, a facility equipped to handle individuals whose severe psychiatric conditions make them both a danger to society and entirely incapable of navigating the ordinary world. Within those walls, her life became centered on daily medications, psychiatric evaluations, and the heavy, unending silence of her own internal reality. The woman who once moved through the suburbs of Houston as a mother, wife, and homemaker was now permanently confined to a structured, highly monitored medical environment where every hour was dictated by the strict routines of institutional care. The transition from a prison cell to a psychiatric hospital did not erase the profound horror of what had occurred, nor did it offer an easy path toward emotional closure for anyone touched by the devastation. But it established a permanent boundary between a deeply sick individual and the outside world she could no longer safely inhabit. The long-term aftermath of the case sent massive, reverberating shockwaves through the medical community, the legal profession, and public consciousness across the United States, fundamentally altering how society perceives and handles severe maternal mental illness. For decades prior to the tragedy, conditions like postpartum depression and the far more dangerous postpartum psychosis were heavily stigmatized, frequently minimized, or entirely misunderstood. New mothers experiencing overwhelming emotional distress, deep despair, or frightening intrusive thoughts were often told simply to push through the exhaustion, dismissed as overly anxious, or given superficial support that failed to address the terrifying chemical and biological storms raging within their brains. The case of Andrea Yates forced an uncomfortable, necessary national conversation that dragged these hidden struggles out of the shadows and thrust them directly into the public square. Medical professionals, researchers, and mental health advocates began speaking openly about the critical distinction between ordinary postpartum blues and the acute, reality-shattering emergency of postpartum psychosis. The tragedy served as a brutal, unforgettable wake-up call, demonstrating with absolute clarity that when severe psychiatric illnesses in new mothers are left untreated, misdiagnosed, or ignored by a fragmented healthcare system, the consequences can escalate into catastrophic, irreversible loss. In the wake of the trials, the medical establishment initiated significant efforts to improve screening protocols, educational outreach, and support systems for pregnant women and new mothers. Gynecologists, obstetricians, and primary care physicians were increasingly trained to look beyond standard physical recovery and actively screen for early warning signs of psychiatric distress, mood instability, and obsessive thoughts during prenatal and postnatal checkups. Hospitals and mental health clinics began implementing specialized programs designed to catch the subtle, terrifying indicators of a failing mind before a patient slipped past the point of return. The tragedy of the 5 children became a permanent case study in medical schools and psychiatric training programs, ensuring that future generations of doctors would understand the immense, life-threatening danger of untreated postpartum psychosis. Furthermore, the case prompted legislative discussions in various states regarding the legal handling of postpartum mental illness, pushing lawmakers and legal scholars to reevaluate how criminal responsibility should be assessed when a defendant's cognitive faculties have been entirely hijacked by a severe, medically documented psychiatric defect. While the rigid legal standards like the Manhattan Rule remain deeply entrenched in many jurisdictions, the public awareness generated by the Yates trial fostered a greater institutional willingness to consider expert psychiatric testimony and recognize the profound limitations of traditional moral culpability when dealing with severe mental illness. Yet, despite the institutional reforms, the medical advancements, and the shifting legal discourse, the human dimension of the tragedy remains an unhealable wound marked by profound sorrow and an enduring sense of loss. The central figures of the disaster had to find their own ways to navigate the agonizing aftermath of a mourning that destroyed their family unit. Rusty Yates, who lost all 5 of his children and saw his wife plunge into an unimaginable abyss of psychosis, faced a lonely, heartbreaking path toward survival. In the years following the trials, he chose to rebuild his life, eventually divorcing Andrea as both individuals attempted to chart separate futures through the wreckage of their shared past. Rusty dedicated a significant portion of his life to raising awareness about mental illness, speaking publicly about the warning signs that were missed, the failure of the medical system to adequately protect his family, and the urgent necessity of providing better support and education for families battling severe psychiatric conditions. His journey became one of public advocacy intertwined with private grief, a testament to the heavy, lingering burden carried by those left behind in the wake of such comprehensive destruction. Andrea herself, living out her days within the secure walls of Kerrville State Hospital, exists in a state of quiet, heavily medicated reflection. Over the years, reports from medical staff and legal representatives have painted a picture of a woman who, under the continuous influence of effective antipsychotic medications, gradually gained a clear, agonizing awareness of the horrific reality of what she had done during her psychotic breaks. Unlike the delusional state that drove her actions on that June morning in 2001, a stabilized mind must now carry the immense, crushing weight of remembering the lives of the 5 children she loved and ultimately destroyed. According to those who have interacted with her within the institution, she chose not to seek release, expressing a deep understanding that she belongs where she can receive continuous care and pose no risk to society. She reportedly spent her time quietly, occasionally engaging in simple crafts or tasks within the facility, living out a subdued, institutionalized penance far away from the public eye that once judged her so harshly. Her existence within the hospital is a silent, constant reminder of the fragility of the human mind and the devastating cost of a psychiatric crisis left unchecked by a failing safety net. As we look back upon the entirety of the narrative, the story of Andrea Yates stands as one of the most complex, haunting, and deeply tragic chronicles in modern American history. It resists easy categorization, refusing to fit neatly into the traditional boxes of good and evil, villain and victim, or crime and punishment. Instead, it occupies a dark, uncomfortable middle ground where medical failure, severe mental illness, domestic pressure, and legal rigidity converge into a single catastrophic morning. The 5 children, Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary, remain the innocent heart of the tragedy, their brief lives forever defined by an ending that no child should ever have to face. Their memory serves as a permanent, solemn reminder of the vital importance of mental health awareness, the absolute necessity of listening to the desperate cries of those suffering from invisible illnesses, and the profound responsibility of society to protect the most vulnerable among us. The case forces every observer to confront the terrifying reality that the mind is a delicate, fragile construct, and that when it breaks completely, the resulting devastation can touch every corner of existence. The quiet halls of the hospital where Andrea resides and the silent bedrooms where 5 children once played stand as bookends to a story that continues to challenge our understanding of compassion, justice, and the unfathomable depths of human suffering. The final perspective on the Andrea Yates tragedy requires us to step back from the specific details of the courtroom battles, the psychiatric diagnoses, and the harrowing timeline of that June morning, and instead examine the broader, enduring legacy this case leaves upon our collective conscience. When a tragedy of this magnitude occurs, it forces a profound transformation in how a society defines responsibility, empathy, and the limits of the human capacity to endure suffering. The story of Andrea Yates is not merely a historical footnote in the annals of American jurisprudence. It remains a living, breathing cautionary tale about the catastrophic cost of isolation, the devastating impact of untreated medical emergencies, and the urgent necessity of building a healthcare infrastructure that catches individuals before they fall off the precipice of reality. The 5 children who lost their lives, Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary, are the eternal center of this narrative, and their absence leaves an empty space that can never truly be filled by legal reforms, medical advancements, or public discussions. Their memories are preserved not just in the grief of their surviving family members, but in the heightened awareness that now surrounds the dark, silent battles fought by countless mothers navigating the treacherous waters of postpartum psychiatric crises. In the years that have passed since the events of 2001, the medical and psychological fields have made significant strides in acknowledging that postpartum psychosis is a distinct, highly dangerous medical emergency requiring immediate, aggressive intervention rather than quiet endurance or societal dismissal. Medical professionals today are far better equipped to recognize the subtle, terrifying red flags that signal a mother's descent into a psychotic state, ensuring that the warning signs ignored or misunderstood in the past are met with comprehensive care and protective oversight. The conversation surrounding maternal mental health has shifted from a place of deep cultural stigma and hidden shame to a more open, compassionate dialogue that encourages women to seek help without fear of judgment. Families and support networks are increasingly educated on the importance of monitoring new mothers not just for physical recovery, but for the profound psychological exhaustion and delusional thinking that can accompany severe hormonal and chemical imbalances. Yet, despite these crucial advancements, the haunting shadow of the Yates case reminds us that the medical safety net remains imperfect and that the human mind can still harbor depths of darkness that escape even the most vigilant professional care. The legal system, too, has been permanently altered by the complexities of the Yates trials, even as rigid statutes like the M. Natten rule continue to govern insanity defenses in many jurisdictions. The case exposed the inherent friction between a legal framework built upon strict definitions of right and wrong and the chaotic, unquantifiable reality of severe mental illness, forcing courts and juries to grapple with the agonizing truth that a person can be entirely detached from moral reality while still possessing the physical capability to execute a series of actions. The national discourse sparked by the trials challenged prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges to approach psychiatric evidence with greater nuance, ensuring that future defendants suffering from acute psychosis receive a fair evaluation of their mental state rather than a blanket condemnation based solely on the physical outcomes of their disease. While the debates over legal sanity and criminal responsibility will undoubtedly continue to evolve as our understanding of the brain advances, the precedent set by the final verdict in 2006 stands as a landmark acknowledgement that justice must sometimes yield to clinical truth when a mind has been completely destroyed by illness. For Rusty Yates, the journey through the wreckage of his former life has been one of enduring sorrow and quiet resilience, defined by a dedication to transforming personal devastation into public advocacy. By speaking openly about the failures of the medical system, the importance of recognizing severe depression and psychosis, and the critical need to support families facing similar crises, he carved out a path of survival amidst overwhelming loss. His efforts to educate the public and champion better mental health resources serve as a vital extension of the tragedy, ensuring that the lessons learned from the loss of his 5 children are shared widely to prevent future catastrophes. While the emotional and psychological scars of that morning can never truly heal, his ongoing commitment to advocacy highlights the human capacity to seek meaning and purpose even within the darkest of circumstances, honoring the memory of his children by fighting to protect others from falling through the cracks of a failing healthcare safety net. Meanwhile, within the quiet, secure confines of the state hospital where she resides, Andrea Yates continues to live out her days under the steady, unchanging routines of institutionalized care. The woman who was once consumed by terrifying religious delusions and driven to commit the unthinkable now exists in a state of stabilized awareness, carrying the immense, crushing weight of a memory that can never be erased. Those who have interacted with her over the years describe a quiet, deeply sorrowful individual who has long since accepted her place within the medical facility, recognizing that her ongoing confinement is both necessary for public safety and appropriate for her own fragile psychological stability. She does not seek freedom or attempt to rewrite the past. Instead, she inhabits a subdued reality where the storm of her psychosis has been silenced by medication, leaving behind the profound, unending grief of a mother who outlived her children by her own hand. Her existence serves as a silent, powerful monument to the devastating intersection of severe illness and tragic human consequence. As we reflect upon the entirety of this profound and harrowing narrative, the story of Andrea Yates remains an enduring testament to the fragility of human existence and the immense responsibility we bear toward one another. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of criminal acts and examine the complex web of medical, social, and psychological failures that often precede a catastrophe. The lives of Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary remind us of the ultimate innocence of childhood and the sacred duty of society to protect the most vulnerable from the invisible monsters that can rise from within the human mind. The tragedy demands our deepest empathy, our unyielding vigilance in supporting mental health initiatives, and our continuous commitment to ensuring that no mother is ever left to drown alone in the terrifying depths of an untreated psychiatric crisis. In remembering them and the complex, broken world that shaped their final moments, we are left with a solemn obligation to foster a culture of compassion, understanding, and proactive care, ensuring that the lessons of that quiet June morning in Houston continue to illuminate the path toward a safer, more empathetic future for all. The final chapter of this profound and harrowing narrative brings us to a quiet, reflective stillness, urging us to look beyond the immediate boundaries of the case and contemplate the deeper, permanent truths that resonate from the tragedy of the Yates family. When we trace the journey from that humid morning in Houston through the grueling legal battles, the shifting medical understandings, and the decades of institutional confinement, we are left standing before a monument of human suffering that defies simple categorization. This story has never been merely about a single horrific event or a courtroom victory or defeat. It is a profound exploration of the absolute fragility of a human mind and the devastating consequences that occur when a society fails to adequately protect and care for its most vulnerable members. The 5 children whose lives were cut short in such an unimaginable manner remain the eternal focal point of this legacy. Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary did not choose the burden of the invisible war being fought inside their mother's head, yet they became the tragic casualties of a system and a disease that overwhelmed every barrier meant to keep them safe. Their memory persists not as a dark spectacle, but as a solemn reminder of the immense stakes involved when mental health crises are overlooked, minimized, or left without the comprehensive intervention they require. In the years that have followed the conclusion of the legal proceedings, the broader cultural and medical landscape has been forced to evolve, carrying forward the hard-learned lessons of the tragedy. The profound awareness surrounding postpartum psychosis and severe maternal mental illness has grown significantly, ensuring that medical professionals are far more vigilant in identifying the early, subtle indicators of a psychiatric collapse. Obstetrics and gynecology have expanded their scope, recognizing that postpartum recovery extends far beyond physical healing and requires an active, empathetic monitoring of a mother's psychological stability. Families, too, are increasingly empowered with education and resources, helping to break down the heavy cultural stigma that once forced women to suffer in silence behind closed doors. Yet, even with these vital advancements, the legacy of the case serves as a permanent caution against complacency. It reminds us that mental illness is a formidable adversary, one that can operate entirely beneath the surface of an ordinary suburban life until it reaches a catastrophic tipping point. The institutional reforms and heightened vigilance we see today are built upon the foundation of a profound collective grief, paid for with the lives of 5 innocent children who deserved a world that could better protect them and their mother from the depths of her disease. The legal system, too, has been forever scarred and shaped by the complexities of the trials, leaving behind a precedent that continues to be studied by legal scholars and ethicists around the world. The journey from a conviction of capital murder to an eventual verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity highlighted the agonizing friction between rigid legal standards and the clinical realities of severe psychosis. It forced a national audience to confront the difficult truth that criminal culpability requires a functioning connection to reality, and that when a disease entirely dismantles a person's cognitive and moral faculties, traditional punishment fails to serve justice. The precedent established in 2006 stands as a legal acknowledgement that compassion and clinical truth must sometimes intersect with jurisprudence when evaluating defendants whose minds have been completely hijacked by medical emergencies beyond their control. While legal debates surrounding the insanity defense will undoubtedly persist as science deepens our understanding of the brain, the Yates case remains a benchmark for how courts grapple with the darkest and most complex intersections of crime, disease, and responsibility. For Rusty Yates, the passage of time has brought no erasure of the profound loss he suffered, but rather a transformation of his private grief into a dedicated public mission. His ongoing efforts to speak out about the failures of the medical system, the critical importance of mental health advocacy, and the urgent necessity of supporting families navigating severe psychiatric crises represent a vital, redemptive thread woven through the tragedy. By choosing to share his story and advocate for systemic improvements, he transformed his personal devastation into a force for change, ensuring that other families might receive the timely interventions and compassionate care that were tragically lacking in his own home. His journey stands as a powerful testament to the human capacity to endure the unimaginable and find a sense of purpose within the ruins, honoring the memories of Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary by fighting to prevent similar catastrophes from happening to others. His voice remains a crucial component of the ongoing conversation, bridging the gap between personal heartbreak and public responsibility. Within the secure and unchanging walls of the state hospital, Andrea Yates continues her quiet, institutionalized existence, far removed from the public eye that once judged her every action. Heavily medicated and stabilized, she carries the crushing, permanent weight of a memory that can no longer be distorted by psychosis, living with the agonizing awareness of what she took from the world on that June morning. Her life within the facility is defined by routine, solitude, and a quiet acceptance of her ongoing confinement, recognizing that her presence there is necessary for her own psychological stability and the safety of society at large. She does not seek absolution or escape. Instead, she occupies a subdued space of perpetual penance, a living embodiment of the tragic cost of untreated mental illness. Her continued existence serves as a silent, powerful monument to the fragility of human sanity and the profound need for a healthcare safety net that never looks away from those who are suffering in the shadows. As we bring this extensive exploration to a close, the story of Andrea Yates remains an enduring, haunting chapter of modern history that challenges our deepest assumptions about compassion, justice, and human nature. It compels us to look beyond the surface of a tragedy and examine the intricate web of medical, social, and psychological factors that converge when a mind shatters completely. The lives of the 5 children remind us of the ultimate innocence of youth and our collective duty to safeguard the vulnerable against the invisible monsters that can rise from within the human psyche. This narrative demands our unyielding empathy, our continuous commitment to mental health education, and our promise to build a society where no individual is ever left to face a severe psychiatric crisis in isolation. In honoring the memories of those we have lost and reflecting upon the complex, broken world that shaped their final moments, we are left with a solemn, lasting obligation to foster a culture of understanding, vigilance, and profound compassion, ensuring that the lessons of that quiet summer morning in Houston continue to guide us toward a safer and more empathetic future. The final continuation of this narrative brings us to the ultimate horizon of reflection, where all the threads of this profound human tragedy weave together into a permanent tapestry of memory, sorrow, and enduring caution. When we look back across the entire expanse of the Andrea Yates case, from the humid suburban mornings in Houston to the quiet, secure corridors of the state hospital and the public platforms of mental health advocacy, we are compelled to confront the deepest, most uncomfortable truths about the human condition. This story has never been merely a chronicle of a single horrific day or a sequence of courtroom battles. It is a monumental testament to the terrifying fragility of the mind and the devastating cost of a society failing to recognize, treat, and embrace those sinking beneath the overwhelming waves of severe psychiatric illness. The 5 children whose lives were extinguished during that fatal 60-minute window remain the eternal, innocent heartbeat of this narrative. Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary did not choose the unseen war waged inside their mother's consciousness, nor could they comprehend the tragic motivations born of a complete detachment from reality. Their memories stand not as morbid relics, but as powerful, solemn reminders of the immense stakes involved when medical warnings are ignored and systemic safety nets are allowed to fray. In the decades that have elapsed since that fateful morning in June 2001, the landscape of mental health care and public awareness has experienced a necessary, albeit belated, evolution. The profound tragedy forced the medical community to drag postpartum psychosis out of the shadows of social stigma and shame, establishing it as a severe, life-threatening psychiatric emergency that demands immediate, aggressive intervention. Today, obstetricians, gynecologists, and primary care physicians are trained to look far beyond the physical recovery of a new mother, actively screening for the subtle, terrifying red flags of emotional instability, obsessive thoughts, and cognitive distortion. Families are increasingly educated to recognize the profound difference between ordinary postpartum exhaustion and the dangerous, reality-shattering collapse of a mind under siege. Yet, even with these critical advancements and institutional reforms, the legacy of the Yates case serves as an unyielding caution against complacency. It reminds us that mental illness is a formidable, relentless adversary that can operate entirely beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary household until it breaches the final defenses. The heightened vigilance and improved support systems we witness today were built upon a foundation of profound collective grief, paid for with the lives of 5 innocent children who deserved a world fully equipped to protect them and their mother from the depths of her disease. The legal and judicial landscape has likewise been permanently reshaped by the complexities of the trials, leaving behind a profound precedent that continues to be analyzed by legal scholars, ethicists, and criminal justice experts around the world. The difficult journey from a capital murder conviction in 2002 to a landmark verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity in 2006 exposed the inherent, agonizing friction between rigid legal frameworks and the clinical realities of severe psychosis. It forced a national audience to confront the difficult truth that criminal culpability requires a functioning connection to reality, and that when a disease entirely dismantles a person's cognitive and moral faculties, traditional forms of punishment fail to serve genuine justice. The precedent established during the retrial stands as a vital legal acknowledgement that compassion and clinical truth must sometimes intersect with jurisprudence when evaluating defendants whose minds have been completely hijacked by medical emergencies beyond their control. While legal debates surrounding the boundaries of the insanity defense will undoubtedly persist as medical science deepens our understanding of the brain, the Yates case remains a benchmark for how courts grapple with the darkest and most complex intersections of crime, disease, and human responsibility. For Rusty Yates, the passage of time has brought no erasure of the profound loss he suffered, but rather a profound transformation of his private grief into a dedicated public mission. His ongoing efforts to speak out about the failures of the medical system, the critical importance of mental health advocacy, and the urgent necessity of supporting families navigating severe psychiatric crises represent a vital, redemptive thread woven through the tragedy. By choosing to share his story and advocate for systemic improvements, he transformed his personal devastation into a force for change, ensuring that other families might receive the timely interventions and compassionate care that were tragically lacking in his own home. His journey stands as a powerful testament to the human capacity to endure the unimaginable and find a sense of purpose within the ruins, honoring the memories of Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary by fighting to prevent similar catastrophes from happening to others. His voice remains a crucial component of the ongoing conversation, bridging the gap between personal heartbreak and public responsibility, and reminding us all that we share a collective duty to look out for one another in times of invisible crisis. Within the secure and unchanging walls of the state hospital, Andrea Yates continues her quiet, institutionalized existence, far removed from the public eye that once judged her every action. Heavily medicated and stabilized, she carries the crushing, permanent weight of a memory that can no longer be distorted by psychosis, living with the agonizing awareness of what she took from the world on that June morning. Her life within the facility is defined by routine, solitude, and a quiet acceptance of her ongoing confinement, recognizing that her presence there is necessary for her own psychological stability and the safety of society at large. She does not seek absolution or escape. Instead, she occupies a subdued space of perpetual penance, a living embodiment of the tragic cost of untreated mental illness. Her continued existence serves as a silent, powerful monument to the fragility of human sanity and the profound need for a healthcare safety net that never looks away from those who are suffering in the shadows. As we bring this extensive exploration to a close, the story of Andrea Yates remains an enduring, haunting chapter of modern history that challenges our deepest assumptions about compassion, justice, and human nature. It compels us to look beyond the surface of a tragedy and examine the intricate web of medical, social, and psychological factors that converge when a mind shatters completely. The lives of the 5 children remind us of the ultimate innocence of youth and our collective duty to safeguard the vulnerable against the invisible monsters that can rise from within the human psyche. This narrative demands our unyielding empathy, our continuous commitment to mental health education, and our promise to build a society where no individual is ever left to face a severe psychiatric crisis in isolation. In honoring the memories of those we have lost and reflecting upon the complex, broken world that shaped their final moments. We are left with a solemn, lasting obligation to foster a culture of understanding, vigilance, and profound compassion, ensuring that the lessons of that quiet summer morning in Houston continue to guide us toward a safer and more empathetic future. The final and concluding perspective on the tragic narrative of Andrea Yates invites us to rest in a profound, solemn stillness, contemplating the permanent echoes of a morning that forever altered our understanding of the human mind. Across all the preceding chapters, we have traversed the dark corridors of severe postpartum psychosis, examined the agonizing timeline of a fateful hour in Houston, navigated the intense battlegrounds of legal responsibility and insanity, and witnessed the long, quiet aftermath of institutional confinement and public advocacy. This extensive journey has not been designed to offer simple answers or comfortable resolutions to an inherently unresolvable tragedy, but rather to confront us with the uncomfortable, stark realities of what happens when a mind completely fractures under the weight of an untreated medical emergency. The 5 children, Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary, remain the pure, innocent heart of this entire history, their brief lives serving as an eternal reminder of the ultimate vulnerability of children and the immense, sacred responsibility that society holds to protect them from the unseen storms that can rise within the human psyche. Their memories are preserved not in the parameters of legal statutes or medical journals, but in the collective conscience of a world that was forever changed by their loss. In looking back at the broader societal and medical landscape, the legacy of the Yates case stands as a powerful catalyst for change, forcing institutions to acknowledge the severe dangers of maternal mental illness and the critical necessity of proactive, compassionate intervention. The transformation in how postpartum psychosis is understood, diagnosed, and treated represents a vital step forward, ensuring that the warning signs once missed or minimized are now met with rigorous medical oversight and empathetic support. Yet, this evolution comes with the heavy, unchangeable cost of tragedy that should never have been allowed to unfold. The case remains a permanent caution against medical complacency, reminding healthcare providers, families, and communities that mental illness is a formidable adversary requiring constant vigilance and robust safety nets. The hard-learned lessons of that June morning continue to shape training programs, inspire legislative discussions, and guide mental health initiatives, ensuring that the suffering of the Yates family serves as a guiding light toward a more protective and understanding future. Within the courtroom, the legal precedents established by the trials will forever remain a landmark reference for how jurisprudence addresses the intersection of severe mental disease and criminal culpability. The journey from the initial conviction to the final acquittal by reason of insanity demonstrated the profound difficulty of applying rigid legal definitions to a mind entirely detached from reality. It forced the legal system to grapple with the reality that true justice sometimes requires acknowledging clinical truth over traditional punishment when a defendant's cognitive and moral faculties have been completely destroyed by illness. Legal scholars, ethicists, and courts will continue to study these trials as a defining moment in the history of the insanity defense, recognizing that the human brain can sometimes break in ways that render conventional concepts of guilt entirely meaningless. The final legal resolution offered a measure of clinical appropriateness by placing Andrea in a secure medical facility, but could never undo the irreversible damage of the tragedy itself. For Rusty Yates, the years following the disaster have been defined by an ongoing, courageous effort to transform deep personal devastation into public education and advocacy. By choosing to speak openly about the critical gaps in the mental health system, the importance of recognizing severe depressive and psychotic symptoms, and the urgent need to support families facing similar psychological crises, he carved out a meaningful path of survival amidst overwhelming loss. His dedication to ensuring that other families do not have to endure the same catastrophic failures keeps the memory of his children alive in a constructive, protective manner. His voice remains a vital component of the ongoing conversation, bridging the gap between private grief and public responsibility, and reminding everyone of the collective duty to look out for those suffering in silence. Within the secure and unchanging walls of the state hospital, Andrea Yates lives out her remaining days in a quiet, heavily medicated state of institutionalized penance, carrying the permanent, agonizing weight of a memory no longer obscured by psychosis. She accepts her ongoing confinement with a subdued resignation, recognizing that her presence in the facility is necessary for the safety of society and her own fragile stability. She does not seek escape or absolution, but instead inhabits a perpetual shadow of sorrow, serving as a living monument to the devastating consequences of an untreated psychiatric emergency. Her existence is a quiet, continuous reminder of the immense fragility of human sanity and the absolute necessity of maintaining a healthcare safety net that never looks away from those in desperate need of intervention. As this exhaustive exploration finally draws to its ultimate close, the story of Andrea Yates remains an indelible, haunting chapter of modern history that challenges our deepest assumptions about compassion, justice, and human nature. It compels us to look beyond the surface of a tragedy and examine the intricate web of medical, social, and psychological factors that converge when a mind shatters completely. The lives of the 5 children remind us of the ultimate innocence of youth and our collective duty to safeguard the vulnerable against the invisible monsters that can rise from within the human psyche. This narrative demands our unyielding empathy, our continuous commitment to mental health education, and our promise to build a society where no individual is ever left to face a severe psychiatric crisis in isolation. In honoring the memories of those we have lost and reflecting upon the complex, broken world that shaped their final moments, we are left with a solemn, lasting obligation to foster a culture of understanding, vigilance, and profound compassion, ensuring that the lessons of that quiet summer morning in Houston continue to guide us toward a safer and more empathetic future. The final and ultimate epilogue to the harrowing narrative of the Andrea Yates case beckons us toward a profound, enduring realm of silent contemplation, inviting us to rest our gaze upon the permanent boundaries of human suffering, institutional responsibility, and collective memory. Across the vast expanse of the preceding chapters, we have walked through the dark corridors of severe postpartum psychosis, meticulously traced the agonizing timeline of a fateful 60-minute window in Houston, analyzed the intense legal battles over sanity and criminal responsibility, and witnessed the long, quiet aftermath of institutional confinement and public advocacy. This exhaustive journey has never been constructed to offer simple, comforting answers or neat resolutions to an inherently unfathomable tragedy. Rather, it has forced us to stare directly into the uncomfortable, unyielding realities of what happens when a human mind completely shatters under the devastating weight of an untreated medical emergency. The 5 children whose lives were extinguished on that quiet summer morning, Noah, John, Luke, Paul, and Mary, remain the pure, innocent heart of this entire history, their brief existences serving as an eternal, haunting reminder of the ultimate vulnerability of youth and the immense, sacred responsibility that society holds to protect the innocent from the invisible, destructive storms that can rise from within the human psyche. Their memories are preserved not merely in the cold parameters of legal statutes or clinical medical journals, but deep within the collective conscience of a world that was forever altered by their sudden and catastrophic loss. In looking back at the broader societal, medical, and cultural landscape, the legacy of the Yates case stands as an unprecedented and powerful catalyst for change, forcing institutions to finally acknowledge the severe, life-threatening dangers of maternal mental illness and the critical necessity of proactive, compassionate intervention. The profound transformation in how postpartum psychosis is understood, diagnosed, and treated across modern healthcare systems represents a vital, long overdue step forward, ensuring that the subtle warning signs once ignored, dismissed, or minimized are now met with rigorous medical oversight, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, and empathetic support. Yet, this necessary evolution carries the heavy, unchangeable cost of a tragedy that should never have been permitted to unfold in the first place. The case remains a permanent, unyielding caution against medical complacency, reminding healthcare providers, family networks, and local communities alike that severe mental illness is a formidable adversary requiring constant vigilance, open dialogue, and robust safety nets that extend far beyond traditional physical recovery. The hard-learned lessons of that June morning continue to shape specialized training programs, inspire legislative discussions, and guide ongoing mental health initiatives, ensuring that the immense suffering of the Yates family serves as a guiding light toward a more protective, informed, and understanding future for mothers everywhere. Within the courtroom, the complex legal precedents established by the rigorous trials will forever remain a landmark reference point for how jurisprudence addresses the delicate, difficult intersection of severe mental disease and criminal culpability. The arduous journey from the initial capital murder conviction in 2002 to the landmark acquittal by reason of insanity in 2006 demonstrated the profound, agonizing difficulty of applying rigid legal definitions to a human mind that has been entirely detached from reality. It forced the legal system to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that true justice sometimes requires acknowledging clinical truth over traditional forms of punishment when a defendant's cognitive, reasoning, and moral faculties have been completely destroyed by a medical pathology. Legal scholars, criminal defense attorneys, prosecutors, and ethicists will continue to study these trials as a defining moment in the modern history of the insanity defense, recognizing that the human brain can sometimes break in ways that render conventional concepts of guilt, intent, and malice entirely meaningless. The final legal resolution offered a measure of appropriate clinical placement by securing Andrea within a specialized medical facility, but could never truly reverse the irreversible damage or heal the profound wounds left in the wake of the tragedy. For Rusty Yates, the years following the disaster have been defined by an ongoing, courageous effort to transform deep personal devastation into public education, awareness, and advocacy. By choosing to speak openly and candidly about the critical gaps in the mental health system, the importance of recognizing severe depressive and psychotic symptoms during and after pregnancy, and the urgent need to support families navigating terrifying psychological crises, he carved out a meaningful, resilient path of survival amidst overwhelming loss. His unwavering dedication to ensuring that other families do not have to endure the same catastrophic institutional failures keeps the memory of his children alive in a constructive, protective manner, transforming private grief into a public force for positive change. His voice remains a vital, enduring component of the ongoing conversation, bridging the gap between personal heartbreak and collective responsibility, and reminding everyone of the shared duty to look out for those who are silently suffering in the shadows of invisible illnesses. Within the secure, unchanging, and highly monitored walls of the state hospital, Andrea Yates lives out her remaining days in a quiet, heavily medicated state of institutionalized penance, carrying the permanent, agonizing weight of a memory that is no longer obscured or distorted by active psychosis. She accepts her ongoing confinement with a subdued, sorrowful resignation, recognizing that her continued presence within the facility is necessary for the safety of society at large and the maintenance of her own fragile psychological stability. She does not seek escape, public attention, or false absolution. Instead, she occupies a perpetual shadow of quiet grief, serving as a living monument to the devastating, far-reaching consequences of an untreated psychiatric emergency. Her existence is a silent, continuous reminder of the immense fragility of human sanity and the absolute necessity of maintaining a healthcare safety net that never turns away from those in desperate need of timely intervention and compassionate care. As this exhaustive and profound exploration finally draws to its ultimate, definitive close, the story of Andrea Yates remains an indelible, haunting chapter of modern history that challenges our deepest, most fundamental assumptions about compassion, justice, and human nature. It compels us to look far beyond the surface of a tragedy and carefully examine the intricate web of medical, social, and psychological factors that converge when a human mind shatters completely under pressure. The lives of the 5 children remind us of the ultimate innocence of youth and our collective, unyielding duty to safeguard the vulnerable against the invisible monsters that can rise from within the human psyche. This narrative demands our deepest empathy, our continuous and passionate commitment to mental health education, and our solemn promise to build a society where no individual is ever left to face a severe psychiatric crisis in complete isolation. In honoring the sacred memories of those we have lost and reflecting deeply upon the complex, broken world that shaped their final moments, we are left with a lasting, permanent obligation to foster a culture of understanding, vigilance, and profound compassion, ensuring that the lessons of that quiet summer morning in Houston continue to guide us toward a much safer, more empathetic, and more protective future for all of humanity.